Welcome to Tech Talks. I'm Holly Scott. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with Bryan Nolan, the CEO and founder of MyBiometry. MyBiometry is empowering individuals living with asthma with data to better predict and prevent asthmatic attacks. Thanks for joining us today, Bryan.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's an enormous market, an estimated 340 million people globally dealing with asthma, a chronic respiratory condition. We hear of it, I believe, most often with children, but it can affect individuals of any age. So I'm excited to dive in and hear what you're doing with this platform.
Yeah, great to be here.
So before we jump into the technology itself, perhaps we could discuss a bit about the road that brought you here.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about your history leading up to founding this organization.
Yeah, so I've spent most of my career, over 20 years now, in healthcare. I started off very much like you, doing HR consulting, but with large insurance companies. So it was very interesting at a young age to learn about how the healthcare system worked from the payer perspective, and dealing with the executives at large payers like United and WellPoint, et cetera. I very quickly realized that I didn't want to do consulting and wanted to actually be in the product development business and wanted to build technologies that actually change people's lives. But healthcare is very complicated, so you need to learn. So I took a sales job with Johnson & Johnson, selling in the operating room endomechanical products. So we made surgical staplers and sutures and hemostatic agents to treat, basically, to help surgeons essentially perform a number of different surgeries. And that gave me the opportunity to learn the industry sort of from the ground up. How do products get developed, sold into the system? How do you interact with hospitals and healthcare providers, contracting? And then I moved from sales into marketing and strategy and things of that nature. Ultimately, leaving to found MyBiometry.
So what was the impetus there? So first of all, the background and exposure on the payer side, it sounds like a nice, strong, fundamental building block when it comes to success in the med tech world. People underclub that so often,
Yep.
how important that experience is, and of course carrying a bag. So from in industry as a commercial representative, how did you bridge into founding the organization?
Yeah. So most of the time within Johnson & Johnson, I was focused on pulmonary medicine. So we did a lot of work with thoracic surgeons and oncologists, mostly doing lung resections. And it was very apparent that, if you don't catch these diseases early enough, the outcomes are terrible, especially with lung cancer. And I really wanted to do something that was focused on earlier detection of disease. And it turns out lung cancer is pretty complicated. And since my background is not in biology, I didn't think discovering biomarkers and building tests around early detection of lung cancer was a good idea for me personally. But as I started to look around at other diseases, I quickly settled on chronic respiratory disease, so asthma and COPD. And you realize, these are massive problems in terms of number of people. About half, so you said 340 million patients with asthma. It's a similar number for COPD. So well over 500 million patients globally. And the problem is very similar to lung cancer, in that if you don't detect the deterioration of disease early enough, bad outcomes happen. And in this case, it's usually attacks. So in asthma, when you have an attack, you're essentially suffocating, and you don't really get a warning sign for it. It tends to come up very quickly from when you start having symptoms. But if you are able to catch it early enough, you can prevent it with adjustments to medicine. And what was really interesting about the space for me is there were biomarkers that already existed, that were part of the guidelines, that enabled early identification of these diseases. It's a biomarker called nitric oxide. It's a marker of airway inflammation. So airway inflammation is actually the underlying cause of symptoms and exacerbations in these diseases. And the technology to measure it was stuck in the pulmonary lab. And it's really something that you need to track on a frequent basis, because it changes based on all of the things that would cause an attack. So whether you're exposed to triggers, things in the environment, et cetera. So we decided that it would be, a really good business opportunity if you could build the technology to move this testing into the home and do it more frequently. And the light bulb moment for me was because Johnson and Johnson has a big diabetes business, which is a wonderful business for diagnostic testing. If you could mimic that business and transform it over to respiratory disease, it would be, you'd help a large number of people, but you'd also build a very successful business with a single-use consumable test strip. And that's really what we decided to do, was to build a technology to measure this biomarker in that way.
It's incredible to stand on the shoulder of the giants from a diabetes perspective, because that's such a light bulb moment when you share that, based on my knowledge of how diabetes has evolved over the last 3 decades, and going from really a guess when we're going to need insulin, when we're going to eat, when do you need to eat, to really having these devices that can live with the individual and help empower them in their condition to manage around it. There's also so many similarities between the diabetes space and what you're working with within pulmonary medicine specifically, because it's been dominated by drugs, and it took a while for devices to find their place. So it's really, really interesting, and I see that as a huge asset, that you've been able to leverage so much of what you know about the diabetes space and bring that intel into this new evolving field that you're focused in.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting because you see with diabetes, every time they increased the amount of information that both patients and physicians received with diagnostic testing, the outcomes more improved significantly. And I think there's a similar path in respiratory disease. When you go from symptom-based management to biomarker-based management, and then more frequent testing of that biomarker, ultimately it'll transform the way that these diseases are both monitored and managed from both the patient and the physician perspective.
Incredible. So let's walk through the current care continuum. So we have, let's say we have a young adult or a child or whomever, a patient, an individual patient. What are we seeing happen for that individual as they are diagnosed and then become treated for asthma?
So there's a couple really big challenges. The first one actually starts with an accurate diagnosis. Asthma specifically is still a clinical diagnosis, so it's a questionnaire from the physician. It's diagnostic tests, lung function tests, allergy tests, et cetera. And it's really a physician putting the picture together to come up with the diagnosis. Unfortunately, it's very complicated, and unfortunately, it's missed about 30% of the time. So it's misdiagnosed one way or another. Either patient does have asthma or doesn't have asthma. So you have a large early diagnostic problem. But let's say that the physician does correctly diagnose somebody. It's really symptom-based management. You get 2 primary medications. You get what's called a rescue medication and a controller medication. The rescue medication is a bronchodilator, so it opens up your airways in case of an emergency. So if you feel like you're having an attack, it stops that sort of in its tracks, or attempts to stop that. They're bad for you, and frequent use is actually a big risk factor for having more severe attacks. The other medication is an anti-inflammatory medication called a controller. It's usually an inhaled corticosteroid or some kind of combination therapy that contains an inhaled steroid. And that's the one that treats the underlying cause of the disease, which is airway inflammation. And you're supposed to take that on a daily basis to suppress the inflammation. Essentially what happens is, patients have an attack. Everything is very reactive. So a patient will have an attack or start having symptoms. They show up at the physician's office. It's a questionnaire based on their symptoms, both the frequency and intensity. Sometimes there's diagnostic tests involved. And then they sort of blindly follow a stepwise algorithm to increase the dose of the medication all the way up until you land on a biological therapy. So it's really trial and error. There's a lot of guesswork underlying all of that. You have the challenge of patients, sporadically taking the medication. So they're taking, it's not that they're non-adherent, they tend to take the wrong medication at the wrong time. Meaning when they start to feel symptoms, they should be increasing their anti-inflammatory medication, but instead they increase the bronchodilator medication. And then you've got acute spikes of, you're exposed to something and it causes symptoms very rapidly. So there's underlying, all of this from the physician's perspective. It's really difficult to understand what's actually going on with the patient. And as you can imagine, a stepwise approach does not necessarily work all the time, and you wind up with about half the people having an asthma attack, at least one time per year. So the outcomes are not where they should be at this point.
So the clinical diagnostic process right now it's not leveraging biomarkers to date?
It's starting to. I think there's been a very large push in sort of the past 5 to 10 years, driven by the pharmaceutical companies and the advent of immunotherapies, or biological therapies in respiratory disease. The pharma companies figured out very early that these therapies are incredibly effective, but only in patients with the right biomarker profiles. One of them is the biomarker we're measuring, nitric oxide. The other one is a blood biomarker. So it's becoming very common now to actually test and stratify patients based on the type of underlying inflammation, because physicians have targeted therapies against those different types of inflammation.
Okay, so we're currently working somewhat within a trial and error capacity when it comes to the individualization in their plan, their course of treatment.
Yeah, that's right. And we're definitely moving towards personalized and stratified medicine in respiratory disease. It's following the same path that almost every other disease has followed. It's a little bit behind the curve, but they're catching up very quickly. And I think COPD, based on the American Thoracic Society meeting this year, COPD is next in terms of stratifying by type of inflammation and delivering targeted therapies towards those patients specifically.
It sounds like it was an interesting engineering challenge. Tell us a bit about that. Maybe give us a visual idea of what it looks
Sure.
like and what goes into this.
Sure. So there's sort of two primary components of what we're doing. I'll start with the device itself. So this is a breathalyzer device. It's connected to an app. So an app powers the entire device, and it's paired with a test strip. So this is a single-use disposable sensor that measures the biomarker that we're measuring, which is nitric oxide. So it's essentially a gas sensor, plugs into the device like this, and the patient blows into it, follows the instructions on the app. The biggest challenge for this was really boiled down to a chemistry and a manufacturing problem. So in order to get the cost of the test strip down below a certain level, in order to make it single use and disposable, you had to formulate a chemistry that could detect this biomarker in a complex stream, which is your breath, at very, very low levels. So getting the formulation of the chemistry right, not just to be able to detect it, but also to manufacture it reproducibly. To give you some idea, if you're going to test somebody every day, it doesn't take a lot of patience to get into the tens of millions of tests that need to be manufactured. So it's a very big manufacturing challenge. The benefit of it is it simplifies. If you can get if you can get the sensor to be a single-use consumable, you pull a lot of cost out of the device. So it makes a very simple, inexpensive device. And going back to sort of the payer story, there's only there's fixed reimbursement that we have to stay within in order to be profitable as a company. So you have to drive the product development in order to fit into that the pre-existing construct that the payers have laid out.
Meaning how your spend essentially on how to get it. We know we can work within this amount essentially per device or per patient, and we need to reverse engineer how to get there.
Correct.
That's a challenge as a CEO in the stage organization you are, even as someone who once operated from a project management perspective. That's a big nut to crack.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy to push the product down into that direction, because launching it without it fitting in the existing construct, the business won't be successful. So there's a lot of energy that we put into making sure that we simplify everything, pull as much cost out of it as we can in the early days, so that we're not 2 or 3 generations away from a product perspective to deliver what we think we can into the market.
Yeah, because I work with so many young companies, it's hypercritical. You can have the best technology, the best solution in the world, but if we aren't considering early and often who's going to pay for it, who's going to use it, and really make pragmatic decisions around your business and operate to them, it's easy for a business to unravel and lose sight of where success can be found.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we spend as much time talking to payers and providers as we do developing the product.
With that said, you shared something interesting with me. Tell me more about where the organization is today, because I found where you're at, state of development, state of clinicals, and partnerships to be quite interesting.
Yeah, so so the company is getting ready to do the clinical study for our regulatory clearance. So we're in the process of scaling up early manufacturing and finalizing the device and locking everything down for the study. We just completed a financing where we had a med tech company participate and also an insurance company participate. The insurance company is going to be our first customer. We're going to pilot the solution as soon as it's cleared from a regulatory perspective. And we're really excited about that opportunity. It'll be a Medicaid asthmatic children, which is a huge unmet need and not an area that a lot of companies are really focused in. But again, you don't need to make huge improvements to really drive clinical difference and really drive change and better outcomes in that particular patient population. They're underserved. They don't really have great access to care. So we think we can make a really big improvement in their lives. And we're also partnering with a large provider group in order to conduct that study.
So that's quite unique. And I'll even go as far as saying de-risk perspective, I think that's a pretty healthy feather in your cap, because having their involvement helps steer the ship early. So not only does it make economic sense, it also is it's a humanitarian effort. I mean, once you're going to not only impact the youth that are benefiting from these devices, but we should see trends with their success go into other payers as well.
Yeah, I think from a lot of the conversations we've had with other payers, it's sort of if you can make this work in Medicaid, we can make it work anywhere. It's a notoriously difficult patient population to deal with. And we're fortunate that the payer that we're partnered with has a large Medicaid focus. So they have additional resources to help support the patients. And obviously the large provider group that we're talking to participate provides specialist level care, which a lot of those patients don't have access to right now.
That's great. So has a challenge for you as a leader been to ensure that you've been fiscally responsible getting up to this point now and now opening up these partnerships?
Yeah, I think that's always a challenge for a startup, right? We don't have the resources that a large corporation has. Coming from J&J, we had resources to do pretty much everything. And at a startup, you have resources to do barely anything. So you have to channel them sort of in the right place, which is getting the product, through regulatory clearance. But I think a lot of companies forget that that's the easy part. The commercial part is actually where things get really complicated and very hard. Up until that point, you're a product development company, and then suddenly everybody just cares about your revenue and your customers and your growth. So we've been mindful of making that transition and how to do it in a way that is scalable and manageable. So starting with one payer in one market, this payer covers multiple states. So there's immediate expansion opportunity built in with a single customer. The provider group we're talking to also covers a number of those same states. So sort of building in scalability and growth right out of the gate. And then, as you can imagine, we have a number of ongoing conversations with other med tech companies from a distribution perspective. We have other payer conversations and other pilots that we're trying to get queued up, behind the scenes. Well, it's really managing the process, managing the pipeline and the flow of potential customers. But again, because we're resource constrained, we have to, they need to be scalable customers.
There must be an advantage to being a product that I assume is prescribed, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that allows you to have the payers move the product as well as the major strategic partners. Yep. I would imagine there's some excitement about this potential technology.
we're taking sort of a unique approach with the payer, in that we're actually using their claims to identify the type of patient that we're looking for, so that we can, do some outreach and enroll them directly, and then have the providers sort of manage that relationship, monitor the data behind the scenes, and be the actual prescriber on record, and then bill the insurance company for all the services that they're providing, including our monitoring. And then, of course, they pay us for the supply of devices, et cetera. So it's a bit of a unique, instead of going to the providers directly and asking them to enroll patients, we went to the insurance company first to identify the patients, and then use the providers to support them from a clinical perspective.
Very, very
And
interesting.
yeah, and what's interesting is it creates sort of a win-win situation, where the insurance company is targeting the type of patient that they want, the provider is getting new patients potentially, but also new revenue streams from existing patients. So it creates a unique scenario for them as well as the payer.
What's the feedback from the clinicians like? What are they seeing and asking for from this data set?
So what I think is really interesting is none of them have ever seen it before. So we showed it. We were at the American Thoracic Society meeting this year. We were invited as one of the respiratory innovation companies, and we got a chance to present to the clinical community and share what we're doing. And what was unique is that it was really an eye-opening experience for a lot of the physicians, because suddenly they were able to see trends in data, trends in the patient's airway inflammation, on a longitudinal basis over months and months. And it creates a very different clinical picture for them. It's very easy to interpret. They know exactly what to do with the information. But it was an eye-opening experience for them. And also for us to see how that data really empowers them to make quick decisions about adjusting therapy or even early outreach to patients. It was really, really sort of fascinating. And the pharmaceutical companies also found it quite interesting when they're thinking about enrolling patients into clinical trials. How do you identify a patient whose inflammation trend is real versus somebody who had a spike, on the day they happen to come in and do a test?
Wow. So the clinician, if they're following the patient's data with your technology, will they get their own subset on an individual basis and then make decisions regarding their prescriptions? Will they own the decisions, or will any of it be given back to the patient themselves?
So it's a little bit of both. So the physicians have access to the data in a dashboard, so they can see the trends on all of their patients. But really, the one of the underlying components of managing asthma specifically is you get what's called an asthma action plan. And those are essentially the written instructions by the physician of what they want you to do in various scenarios, which medication to take, how much of it, when do you call them? And we really envision what we're doing is fitting right into that, where it's really the physician giving written instructions on, when the data says this, I want you to do that. Which is sort of, fits into the current standard of care, today. And as you can imagine, behind the scenes, it's very easy for us to be monitoring the data with pretty simple algorithms, and creating alerts and outreach to patients and the physicians to alert them that something is out of range, and, either call your physician or, follow your asthma action plan.
Interesting. So the patient will be on the journey with the clinician, and they will be learning along the way too. And what I like about this model that I've seen in anything that follows along chronic conditions is that patient, especially you see it prominently in diabetes, they do feel more in control of their own health from a holistic perspective. You see it in the cardiovascular world with a lot of the great monitoring devices. You even see it in the consumer world with athletes that are able to drive their data. So the more information you have and start understanding, the more holistic you tend to be about your health overall. And especially somebody who's dealing with a chronic condition, that's got to be pretty empowering.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the things that's really unique about what we are doing specifically is that the biomarker we're measuring will actually change based on whether you're taking your medication or not. So you're not only are you empowered to understand that it's rising and it'll go up because you're exposed to asthma triggers and things like that in the environment. So you can see that it's rising, but you actually have a tool, a prescription that is already you've got tools already in your medication that you can make the biomarker go down, reduce your risk, and you can watch it in almost real time. It'll go down within hours of actually taking your medication, and it will continue for a period of days. So I think that's really powerful for patients to see, not just to provide them with information, but also to see how things in the environment, how their medications are actually impacting the number and driving the trends.
Fascinating. So where does COPD fit in? Is that are we focused on asthma for some period of time and then COPD is next?
Yeah, we're focused predominantly on asthma just because the story of how airway inflammation impacts asthma is well established. The biomarker we're measuring is more frequently used in asthma. COPD, the discovery of airway inflammation is one of the underlying factors that drives the disease, is relatively new. And I say that in that this year will be the first registered biologic for COPD. It was a drug originally approved for asthma, and they did tests in COPD patients that they stratified based on inflammation. And it turns out that it was effective, and they passed both of their phase 3 studies. So I think just from the clinical story and the clinical community is just sort of picking up on COPD next. So I think that's coming down the road. The story in COPD is a little bit different from asthma, and the problem is as big, if not bigger. I think one of the things that's really unique that I didn't really know about COPD until I attended the American Thoracic Society meeting recently is that a patient who has a severe attack of COPD that lands them in the hospital, over half of those patients will die within 5 years of having that attack. So that mortality rate is actually worse than cancer. And what happens is every time you have an exacerbation of COPD or an attack, it damages your airways. They don't fully recover, and it progressively happens over and over and over again. So it's something that I think the story is going to be quite compelling, especially as the population in the U.S. and around the globe starts to get older, and as COPD becomes more prevalent than it is today. It's already the third leading cause of death globally, and I think that's going to go up. And again, these are preventable if you can catch things early enough and start treating the patient earlier. And I think it's really exciting in COPD that physicians will have now biological therapies to really stop that progression early on. So we can help in that story, identifying who the right patients are, but also monitoring them early so that these attacks can be prevented.
Yeah, COPD is a horrific disease, when you see people suffer, and even asthma in its worst scenarios, when you have those attacks and you end up hospitalized, it's scary. So I'm bullish about your success in both platforms, both areas, because I think there's so much opportunity and so many individuals you can impact. That's great to hear.
And I think that the other piece that I think it's really not talked about, especially in asthma, is the mental aspect of it, the anxiety of living, walking around knowing that at any given moment you could have an attack. And when that happens, essentially you suffocate. And it's terrifying. And it really does take a mental toll. We've talked to patients, that literally won't leave their house because they didn't have access to their medication. And they were so scared of having an attack that they basically locked themselves in their room for 2 weeks until the medication showed up. So there's a big mental component too. And it goes back to your comment about empowering patients. When you have information about your disease, it empowers you to live your life in a more normal way. And I think that's amazing for patients.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're seeing that trend in neuro, in empowering epileptic individuals and trying to get them in a preventative mode, and obviously diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The best aspect that I have seen where tech has influenced the medical device sector is the empowerment from a diagnostic perspective, exactly what you're on. So this is exciting. So the next 12 to 24 months are going to be pretty busy. What's on the horizon here? What are some of our big meaty milestones?
Yeah, so we have a couple of them. One, getting everything ready for the clinical study is sort of milestone number one. So that's just finishing up product development and doing our initial tests to make sure that the study will be successful. Then executing the clinical study and then submitting for regulatory clearance. And after that, getting into the pilot and the early commercial efforts. So that's sort of our primary objectives over the next 12 months.
Excellent. Excellent. So we can't wrap without congratulating you on being a MedTech Innovator cohort company. That's a nice high bar in the industry, really well respected. How's that experience been for you?
It's been an amazing experience. We've been exposed to a couple different things that I think are highly valuable. One is just the network of other entrepreneurs and seeing what they're working on and the challenges and how unique and innovative their solutions are. So I think that's getting into that network of other companies is really fascinating. And then we've been exposed to some of the sponsors and their expertise. So the value-based program, I think, to me has been the most impactful. We've gotten a chance to speak with Dexcom's Vice President of Health Economics. So really, bouncing our ideas and strategies off of companies and individuals who have been there and done that, I think is really powerful. We've got an opportunity to really change how one of the largest chronic diseases is actually monitored and managed, and to be able to talk to people from companies that have done similar things in diabetes is just incredibly powerful for us.
Phenomenal. Well, I'm excited to see what the next 12, 24, and beyond bring for you, Bryan, and the team. What's the best way for anyone interested to get in touch with you, to find out more, considering any investment or perhaps joining the organization?
So the easiest way is going to our website, so www.mybiometry.com. There's a contact us page. It goes directly to me. So if people are interested, that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Great. Well, I know you are traveling, and I so appreciate you making some time here in your busy calendar to spend with us today here on Tech Talks.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. And to our audience, thank you for joining us again, and we'll see you next time.